Ancient Kemit on Trial, a meticulous look at the true origin of Kemetic culture and religion by Abdiel Ben Levi. Chapter 1. Dynastic Race Theory. The ancient world has witnessed many cultures and civilizations who have played a vital role in the history of the world. The early civilizations of the world are considered today have been hydraulic civilizations, for they all started near or adjacent to a large body of water. We tend to forget today, because of our modern standards of living, just how integral a role of living that near natural resources of water played a major role in how ancient civilizations thrived, advanced, and in some cases even conquered. Among the earliest known civilizations, two stand out most in terms of their antiquity, which are the civilizations of the Fertile Crescent, meaning Mesopotamia, and the Nile Valley, meaning Kemit, aka Egypt. There are no known civilizations to date which predate the civilizations of the Fertile Crescent and the Nile Valley. From these two culturally advanced civilizations, the ancient nations, peoples, and cultures received their knowledge of science, mathematics, philosophy, religion, and language. Yet the major debate or question which has perplexed historians is, which one of these two civilizations emerged first? Everyone has their opinion, yet from a scholarly point of view, in order for this question to be answered, three major points within the field of research must be addressed, which are the archaeological record, oral history, and etymology and linguistics. For these three methods are most credible when pursuing a point of origin in history. We will initiate our quest with laying out the archaeological records. From the point of view of archaeology, the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, and the Nile Valley civilizations did not emerge contemporaneously, but in fact, one does precede the other. The archaeological record says that the Sumerian civilizations began around 5500 through 4000 BC, while it dates Egyptian or Kemetic civilizations to about 3500, 3100 BC. The Sumerian protoscript, which is pictorial in nature, emerges in 4000 BC and develops into what is known today as cuneiform script, while the hieroglyphics or medu neter didn't arrive and emerge in Egypt until 3100 BC, and the stellar emergence raised the eyebrows of Flinders Petrie, who is regarded today as the father of Egyptology, and in many respects the father of archaeology, as the work and field of archaeology pioneered and founded many major components of how archaeologists gather information. Petrie, among several other Egyptologists, are very perplexed about not just the sudden emergence of Egyptian civilization, but also its language. From the point of view of archaeology, Egyptian seems literally burst into emergence as an advanced civilization without any record of how their civilization developed and became so advanced. This poses a very serious question and even a red flag for both Egyptologists as well as archaeologists. Every civilization which emerged in history has a record of their pre-advanced culture, meaning Egypt burst into historic scene as a highly culturally advanced people. While a novice of archaeology and history may not be perplexed by this, a genuine historian and archaeologist understands that every culture and civilization shows signs of cultural development from the primitive to the advanced. Flinders Petrie is also bothered by this, that he begins to question every piece of evidence regarding Egypt's supposed origin and compares it with the archaeological data that he discovered, and what he undiscovered caused quite a stir in the realm of archaeology and history, and lead to him introducing what is now known as the dynastic race theory. While digging in Akkad, which is just north of Luxor in Upper Egypt, Petrie has found a mass burial site, which made this site's finding groundbreaking. Is that its contents dated back to pre-dynastic Egypt, yet which was uncovered caused great astonishment for the findings revealed two very diverse people in pre-dynastic Egypt. One find is termed Nakata 1. This is where we find simple pottery, primitive tools, and skulls typical of ancient Egyptians. Then there is Nakata 2, where was found advanced potteries of all shapes and sizes, totally different than pottery which is indigenous to Egypt. He also found there in Nakata 2 that bodies of the dead were buried drastically different from the Nakata 1. This became an initial indicator of these two findings, indicating two different peoples. After all of the evidence was gathered from both sides, Nakata 1 and 2, Petrie discovered that the more advanced site, Nakata 2, had contents which clearly not only resembled Mesopotamian culture, but in fact was a little telltale sign that the pre-dynastic Egypt, Mesopotamia, played a major role in the cultural advancement of ancient Egypt. These findings laid the foundation for what is termed the dynastic race theory, an archaeological-based theory which posits that pre-dynastic Egypt was invaded by a highly advanced culture coming out of Mesopotamia, which influenced ancient Egypt and its culture. These Asiatics conquered Upper Egypt and settled in a city they call Nakin, which literally means the city of the falcon, which later became the inspiration for Flinders Petrie to label these early Asiatic conquerors of Egypt as the Falcon tribe. These Asiatic conquerors, according to the father of Egyptology, this then, according to Petrie, explains why ancient Egypt burst into the annals of history as a highly advanced civilization, because the proponents or foundations of pre-dynastic Egypt were heavily influenced and, in a sense, founded by Asiatic conquerors from Mesopotamia, Sumeria, who themselves came from a more advanced civilization in the east, meaning Mesopotamia. As you can imagine, the above discovery sent shockwaves throughout the sphere of archaeology and history. For before this discovery by Petrie, many historians viewed ancient Egypt as an autonomous country which reflected its own unique and distinct achievements. Yet Petrie's finding challenges this view. What Petrie discovered, as will be developed in the later chapters, is a very major innovation attributed to ancient Kemit. Egypt actually has Asiatic fingerprints showing Sumerian influence over what was formerly credited to Egypt alone. What would be revealed will shock and even outrage many. Yet when one is a seeker of truth, you know not to pursue it with any emotional dissonance. So prepare yourself to embark upon a scholastic reassessment of a civilization whose greatest achievements do not bear its indigenous imprint. The dynastic race theory has sufficient archaeological data to support the idea that foreign invaders from Mesopotamia entered ancient Egypt, conquered its natives, and united its kingdoms. This influx of Asiatics in Egypt introduced advanced scientists, mathematics, textiles, and poetry, as well as philosophy and religion, so that to this day the ancient spiritual system of Egypt reflects the forerunner in Sumerian culture along the Fertile Crescent. This history repeats itself in Egypt's Middle Kingdom, where Asiatic conquerors known today as the Hyksos conquered Egypt in the Middle Kingdom era, and once again, with the influx of Asiatics in Egypt comes a change and renaissance in the cultural and intellectual landscape of Egypt. Rock paintings, carvings in Egypt shows Mesopotamian-styled boats literally being dragged across the soil into the interior of Egypt, thus supporting the dynastic race theory idea that as the foreign Asiatic invaders from Mesopotamia sailed along the Arabian Peninsula into the Red Sea and dragging their boats across the arid lands of Egypt, just as depicted in several rock paintings in Egypt itself. Opposers of the dynastic race theory state that although Mesopotamian influence on early Egypt is undeniable, it is not enough to suggest acculturation because of influence Mesopotamia had on pre-dynastic Egypt is limited to architecture and very small cultural elements indicative of Mesopotamian culture. The problem with this is that they discern with the opposing view is the idea that the ancient Sumerians or Mesopotamians employed sacred geometry in the building of their great temples. Hence, in order to duplicate or replica of Mesopotamian style structures such as ziggurat of Mesopotamia found in Saqqara of ancient Egypt, one would have to be very immersed in Mesopotamian sciences and mathematics and philosophy. Thus, it is not just a borrowing of architecture, it is the borrowing of Mesopotamian mathematics, science, and philosophy as well. One of the assumed flaws of the dynastic race theory is the differences in writing between the Mesopotamian cultures and the writing of the Nile Valley, widely known as the hieroglyphics, but scholastically known as the Medu Neter. As will be explored in the later chapters, what is assumed as a difference between the Egyptian writing and Sumerian or Mesopotamian writing is nothing more than ignorance of the inherent relationship between the two styles of writing. Another reason is why the dynastic theory was rejected, particularly in African scholastic circles, is because the proponents of this theory began to introduce European civilization into the pre-dynastic civilization. By whitewashing the Asiatics, who were known to be a people of color, and even going so far as to state that the Greeks and original inhabitants of Asia Minor, Europeans, also contributed to pre-dynastic Egyptian culture. I do not support this last conclusion, simply because racism was at the epicenter of it and the desire to promote the supremacy of European culture by making it the precursor of African culture when both history and archaeology disagrees with such an unfolded claim. From the perspective of the Torah, or Bible, the peoples of the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, were originally people of color. In fact, the Torah is one of the only sources of antiquity to point out that the empires and civilization of Mesopotamia began with a Cushite Ethiopian ruler and dynasty, the infamous Nimrod, who conquered from Sumeria, Mesopotamia, to Cush, as the Torah relates. The beginning of his kingdom is Babylon, Genesis chapter 10, verse 10. So contrary to popular opinion, the dynastic race theory is not flawed by a desire for European supremacy. For the pre-dynastic race which invaded Egypt from Mesopotamia were a melanated people of color. This then revives this theory, which was and is still rejected in Afrocentric circles, yet its rejection is primarily based upon the fact that this theory became the whitewashed and viewed from European spectacles only. Yet once it is retold from a genuinely credible lens void of racial bias or agenda, it then resurfaces with the plethora of archaeological data which found, discovered, and supported it. Jibo el Arak Nife. The various evidence for the dynastic race theory are thus: the archaeological discovery of skulls in the Nakata II dig shows a sharp contrasting difference between the smaller skulls of ancient Egyptians and bears more resemblance to the larger skulls of the Asiatic Mesopotamians. The Jebel el-Arak Nefe, dated back to the Naqada II period of pre-dynastic Egypt, depicts in its handle a Chaldean Sumerian Asiatic dressed man with two lions in his grasp, has led many to believe that the man depicted in this picture is a famous hunter of Mesopotamia and will be discussed in the later chapters. The Nefe handles also depict a land battle, which many believe captures an eyewitness's account of the battle which united pre-dynastic Egypt and led to its first dynasty. Both a land and naval battle are depicted on the reverse side of the Nefe's handle, further lending credence to the idea that the Nefes was explicitly designed to commemorate the Asiatic invasion, conquering, and uniting the pre-dynastic or early Egypt. This then discredits the rebuttal that the Asiatic influence in early pre-dynastic Egypt can be limited to trade, because of the Nefes seem to tell a story which goes much beyond mere trade as the basis for Mesopotamian appearance in pre-dynastic Egypt, especially seeing that the naval battle on the Nefe depicts warriors on a squared Mesopotamian-styled boat, defeating soldiers on a circle-shaped boat, typically of early Egyptian-styled boats. The Narmer palette also describes what clearly indicates a Sumerian Asiatic conqueror or uniter of early pre-dynastic Egypt. On one side of the palette, an Asiatic king is depicted grasping the hair of his enemy in one hand and a club or mace in the other hand, which would be used to crush his enemy's head. There is a falcon adjacent to him standing over the reeds of the Nile, which is supposed to indicate that the gods have favored the Asiatic kinship over Egypt, as both Mesopotamia, Sumeria, as well as Egypt, the falcon represented the divine gods. The opposite side of the palette depicts, at the very top center, the hieroglyphic symbol for fish, which is Nar, and the symbol or glyph for chisel, which is Mer, hence the name Narmer, who is personified as a demigod, which emerges from the primeval waters like a fish and rises to greatness by building, indicated by the chisel, the first great cities and civilizations of antiquity. As depicted above, these scenes indicate that the Asiatic conquerors and their leader Narmer, whom the Sumerians call Nemaru and the Hebrews called Nimrod, as subjugating all of Egypt and uniting all of its provinces and nomes. In fact, the Hebrew tradition has always been that Nimrod's kingdom began in Sumeria, yet reached as far as Egypt, as the Torah relates, as it begins in Sumer, Shinar, Babylon, and ends in Egypt. Genesis chapter 10, verse 10 through 13. The warrior, hunter, King Narmer, who is also known as Menes in Egypt, is said to have been slain by a hippopotamus, which ironically is the same story told of Osiris or Asar of Egypt, who was killed by his brother Set, who is personified in the Egyptian mystery system as a hippopotamus. Thus it can be deduced that Narmer, known also as Menes, is indeed Osiris, known as Asar in the Kemetic language, and hence we know that Nimrod or Nemaru is what the Semitic Asiatics called him. It then follows that Nimrod is Osiris. This fact is proven esoterically in the Hebrew language, for in Hebrew, Nimrod is numerically equivalent to 294, which is also the numerical equivalence in Hebrew of Osiris, which conveys on an abstract level the relationship between Nimrod and Osiris, who were actually one and the same person, Nimrod, after conquering Egypt, became known as Kemit, as Assur, whom Greeks called Osiris. Thus, this chapter alone clearly indicates that not only was the pre-dynastic Egypt invaded by Asiatic foreigners, but the same foreigners conquered it and gave the early Egyptians their language, culture, and spiritual philosophies, as will be proved in the later chapters. This means then that what is thought to be of Egyptian origins actually has Semitic, Kushite, and or Asiatic fingerprints, which points to the Sumerian or Asiatic origin of the philosophical, cultural, architectural, and spiritual advancement in Egypt known as Kemit. The origins of pharaonic civilizations have always been shrouded in the mystery. What caused dynastic culture to burst forth in the Nile Valley within such a relatively short period of time? There is little evidence of kingship and its rituals very much before the beginning of the first dynasty. No signs of the gradual development of metalworking, art, monumental architecture, and writing, the defining criteria of earlier civilizations. Much of what we know about the pharaohs and their complex culture seems to come into existence in a flash of inspiration. And this you can find in David Rawls' legend, The Genesis of Civilization, printed in 1998, page 265. Flinders Petrie, one of the foremost scholars of Egyptology, coined the phrase the Falcon tribe as a reference to the Asiatic invaders and conquerors of pre-dynastic Egypt. Upon excavating near the village of Nakata in Upper Egypt, Petrie stumbled upon a huge burial site of over 2,000 graves. In this period of history, craniometrology, the study of skull sites and used to determine racial origin, the first dig at Nakata first showed the skulls of typical Egyptian makeup. However, the Nakata II dig shows skulls typically indicative of Asiatic and Mesopotamia or Sumeria. The objects discovered in the Nakata I dig, which typically describe primitive Egypt, conveyed a very unadvanced people, as the pottery, jewelry, and style of burial was primitive in comparison to contemporary cultures in Mesopotamia. The Nakata II dig, however, which began again was the Asiatic Mesopotamian findings in Egypt, showed a much more culturally advanced people, whose findings conveyed that they were technical elites of their era. This led to the development of what Flinders Petrie called the dynastic race theory, a theory based in archaeological findings which indicated that the pre-dynastic Egypt there was an invasion of a superior group of Asiatics who conquered pre-dynastic Egypt, who came by way of Mesopotamia, meaning Sumeria. These invaders conquered Upper Egypt and established a city they called Nakin, which literally means falcon tribe, hence why they were later referred to by the foremost Egyptologist, Flinders Petrie, as the Falcon tribe. From then, they came the very first kings of Egypt, also known as the Horus kings. Horus being synonymous with the falcon in ancient Egypt, as it is to this day. This falcon tribe of Asiatic Mesopotamian origin became synonymous with kingships in ancient Egypt and the Horus falcon dynasties. Throughout the Egyptian kingship, the culture, philosophy, and religion of the falcon Horus tribe prevailed. As will be shown in later chapters, the invasion of ancient Egypt by Asiatics came by way of the Red Sea, which was their entry point into the Nile Valley. Evidence of this Asiatic falcon Horus tribe invasion into Egypt is found as carvings on the rock walls of the valleys, which shows a massive army of square-style Mesopotamian boats, whose kings or rulers stands in the center of the mace. Just like King Narmer, the first known king of Egypt, is depicted with a mace in his hand. The carved paintings show these boats being dragged across the deserts of Egypt, indicating these foreign invaders from Mesopotamia intended to return to their lands as well. Hence, while they were there, sure to take their boats with them into the Nile Valley cataracts. Later on in Egyptian history, the boats of Asiatic invaders became a focal point in Egyptian worship and ceremony, as they later held these boats to be so sacred to Egyptian history that they buried them adjacent to the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Those boats were buried during the buildings of the Great Pyramids of Giza and were viewed as ceremonial testimonies of the culturally advanced Asiatic invaders, which became in Egyptian mythos a symbol of the ships which carried and transported Ra through the heavens. In other words, the Asiatic invaders themselves became a chief cornerstone and pillar of ancient Egyptian religion, who, because of their technological culture and philosophical contributions to early Egypt, were viewed as gods to ancient Egyptians. In fact, as evidenced in the first chapter, the Jebel el Arak Nefe gives an eyewitness account of the Asiatic invasion of Egypt. There is on this side of Nefe's handle the hunter scene, also known as the master of animals, seen the hunters wearing a Sumerian garment with Asiatic style facial beard, when it is known fact that the Egyptians did not wear beards. Yet their later kings wore mock beards or false beards because they were trying to mimic the early kings of Egypt, the Asiatic conquerors, invaders. The scenes depicted on the handles of this Nefe testify to the Asiatic invasion of Egypt and the subsequent conquering and uniting of it by these elite foreign rulers. The Sumerian fingerprints are then all over Egypt's first dynasty and pre-dynastic era. In Egyptian religion and folklore, the boats of the Asiatic invaders held a sacred place and meaning, known as barks. These sacred Asiatic ships became a cornerstone of Egyptian folklore. There were annual ceremonies where the reenactment of the Asiatic invasion was conveyed in a language which removed the invasion and replaced it with honor to the gods of Egypt. There were the solar ships of Ra, a chief god of Egypt. There were also funerary boats which accompanied the kings of Egypt in the afterlife, who were also viewed as gods. This sums up the esoteric meaning of the king deification in ancient Egypt. The Asiatic invaders, who became the first kings of Egypt, brought so much innovation to Egypt that they literally were viewed as gods. This explained why every subsequent ruler of Egypt was viewed as God incarnate. As we explore these thoughts more in depth, we will see that Sumeria, as well, Nimrod or Narmer, was venerated and worshipped, and an origin of God incarnate, earthly kings, actually has its origin in Sumeria, where civilization itself began and originated. In Sumeria, the falcon is represented under the Anunnaki gods of Sumeria and Nisroch. The Sumerian falcon god is always depicted in Sumeria as a being with a falcon's head and the body of a man, wearing a pouch and holding a pine cone. The pine cone depicted in Sumerian art has its subsequent equivalent in ancient Egypt. To the Sumerians, the pine cone represented the pineal gland, as the very shape of the pineal gland literally resembles that of a pine cone, and just as the pineal gland was viewed in Egypt as representing enlightenment or the third eye, so it is in ancient Sumeria that this pine cone or pineal gland also represented the third eye. This representation is later introduced into Egypt, where it becomes known as the Eye of Horus, or Wadjet, indicating the pineal gland. Yet, as noted above, this idea is first represented in Sumeria, not Egypt. The esoteric sciences of Sumeria are the foundations of the Egyptian mystery system, and as these thoughts conclude in this book, the above points were firmly established in the reader's mind. This depiction of a falcon god, which was first discovered in Sumeria, Mesopotamia, its place of origin, and is later reproduced in ancient Egypt as the Egyptian deity god Horus. The Sumerians were speaking of the pineal gland or the third eye long before introduced it into Kemit, aka Egypt. The very shape of the pineal gland itself literally resembles a pine cone. This representation of the pineal gland as a pine cone is found throughout the ancient world. Thus, all of the images which are currently circulating on the internet of the Eye of Horus as the pineal gland is actually a misnomer, for the first civilization documented as speaking about the pineal gland is the Sumerians, not Egyptians. The image on the left is a falcon god as it appears in Sumeria, and the image on the right, which is much later Egyptian carbon copy, which was reproduced in Egypt via its Mesopotamian influence. The falcon tribe, then as Flinders Petrie came to call the pre-dynastic invaders and conquerors of early Egypt, are based in Sumeria, where the falcon was venerated along the early Sumerian kings, who sometimes appeared in the form of a falcon, this being the Asiatic precursor to the much later Horus king of Egypt, which many Egyptian dynasties fall under, making the bloodline of the first Egyptian dynasties Asiatic by way of Sumeria. As seen above, the Sumerian kings were depicted in art and personifications or divine incarnates of the falcon god of Sumeria, which is later mimicked in ancient Egypt, where Horus, kings of Egypt, were depicted, and personifications or divine incarnations of the falcon god Horus. The figure above shows just how globally diffused early Mesopotamia's influence was, because the falcon god of Sumeria is depicted around the world, with Egypt, Ecuador, and Mexico, places known to have the ancient Sumerian step pyramids, all having borrowed the same elements and incorporated it into the fabric of their philosophies and culture. The religion of the falcon tribe of Sumeria, Mesopotamia, became a cornerstone of religious rites, philosophies, and expressions throughout the pagan worlds, with Egypt being its first main descendant. According to modern archaeology, writings began in Mesopotamia with the Sumerians in about the 4th or 5th millennium BCE. Writing doesn't reach Egypt until the 3rd millennium BCE, which is approximately around 3500 through 3100 BCE. The writings which developed in Sumeria is known today as cuneiform, which is Latin, cuneus, meaning wedge, and the word form, indicating a wedge form of writing engraved in stone and sunk in mud or clay. While excavating in Egypt, Flinders Petrie discovered several cindular seals which originated in Mesopotamia, Sumeria, which was used in Sumeria for the ratification of contracts. The cylinder was rolled onto a mud or clay surface, and the negative image produced a seal which could be used in businesses' transaction. What's highly significant to note here is that this is a Sumerian-based practice. Thus, the fact that it was found in Egypt with Sumerian images clearly indicates and establishes the Sumerian presence in pre-dynastic Egypt, as noted elsewhere with distinct archaeological evidences. The cylinder seals of Sumeria represented the very first evidence of systematic writing systems. The seals contained cuneiform inscriptions, which again is regarded in modern archaeology as the very first writing system known to man. Yet, unlike the hieroglyphics, cuneiform has a proto-pictograph ancestor, its precursor, which shows ideologically how cuneiform scripts developed. Every writing system on the earth has a prototype or pictograph precursor, which entails how the script developed from intangible ideas to phonetic symbols. Egyptian hieroglyphics, however, do not have a prototype. While this may not bother a novice, it certainly disturbs a language etymologist or linguistics who knows that every single language has a prototype. As we will see, this caused an intellectual red flag which puts the writing system of ancient Egypt under stern scrutiny, and what was revealed will shock many who are reading this. Cuneiform is read from left to right with vertical columns, similar to the language of the Orient. However, its pictographic ancestors comes out of Syria, northern Israel, in the ancient city of Ugarit. According to archaeology, Ugarit may in fact be even older than Sumeria, thus making the land of Israel the scene of man's nativity and origin. Archaeologists date the establishment of history to the 7th or 8th millennium BCE, thus 2 or 3 millenniums longer or older than Sumeria, and 4 to 5 millenniums older than Egypt. Ugarit is Semitic in origin, and Ugarit cuneiform therefore has a Semitic base. According to Ugarithic records, the precursor script for Ugarithic cuneiform is pictograph Hebrew, otherwise known as Proto-Canaanite. Thus, from this point of view of archaeology, Proto-Canaanite or pictographic Hebrew is the precursor for Sumerian cuneiform, whose precursor is Ugaritic cuneiform, whose prototype is pictographic Hebrew, thus firmly driving home the Torah-based point that all languages have etymological stem. Genesis chapter 11, which ultimately traces back to Hebrew, the holy language. Thus, Hebrew is the etymological or linguistic stem of cuneiform, which according to modern archaeology is the oldest language. The hieroglyphics now of ancient Egypt developed from the cuneiform and its pictorial base. This is clearly one reviews the linguistic sounds and meanings of the Medu Neter or hieroglyphics and compares and contrasts its sounds and meanings with cuneiform, which precedes it. This then will firmly establish the fact that the Medu Neter or hieroglyphics did not develop first or independent of cuneiform, but in fact is developed directly from it, thus making the writing systems of ancient Egyptian a Sumerian Asiatic descendant. Wow. Think about that. The linguistic base of the Medu Neter hieroglyphics shows much similarity and even origin in the Sumerian cuneiform script and language. The pictorial languages used in the precursor script of cuneiform predate that of Egypt by at least 1,000 years. In fact, Egypt's own history records that writing in its invention that came to Egypt with Menes, meaning Narmer, the first dynastic king of Egypt, who Egyptologist Sir Flinders Petrie associates with the Falcon tribe invaders of Sumeria and their ruler. Yet the Zep Tepi tradition of Egypt speaks of a time long before the Pharaonic dynasties, which clearly suggests that even the Egyptian records faithfully documented that writing did not begin with them. This is a testimony to which archaeology already confirms that writing began in Sumeria long before the Egyptians were introduced to it. In fact, a thorough analysis of the precursory pictographic cuneiform script shows a striking resemblance to what the ancient Egyptians later adopted and called Medu Neter hieroglyphics, which literally means the language of the gods. As the latter chapters attest to, The Sumerian culture greatly influenced ancient Egypt, and because of their superior and advanced culture, and throughout which came out of Sumeria, the Sumerians were viewed as natural gods by the ancient Egyptians. Hence, why the language that the Egyptians developed from Sumerians, Metuneta, literally means the language of the gods. In fact, some of the key names for Egyptian gods are displayed on the chart below as having Sumerian origin. The first thing we see upon examining the Egyptian hieroglyphics versus its Sumerian forerunner is that the Egyptian term Asar, meaning Osiris, actually comes out of the cuneiform Sumerian script, where he is called Asuru, which literally means Lord or God Asar, Osiris, or entitled Son of the Sun. The pictorial image or representation, for it is the eye under the throne, both in the Medunetta or hieroglyphics and the cuneiform. In the Sumerian, we see that Bar means house, just as Par means house in the Medunetta, and is explained as the origin of the terms Pharaoh, which means in the Medunetta the house of so-and-so. Interestingly enough, the Sumerian kings were also addressed as Baro. The Sumerians' origin of Pharaoh, as seen throughout the Sumerian king list, the title Boro, Sumerian equivalent to Pharaoh, preceding the name of each king in the Sumerian king list. This is another testimony to the cultural influence of the Sumerians had over ancient Egypt. The word or term for hawk, falcon, is bak, both in Sumerian as well as Egyptian hieroglyphics, both utilizing a bird as its standard or icon. We also see that Ra, as depicted in the Medunetta or hieroglyphics as the sun, actually originates in Sumeria, bearing the exact same name or appellation with the sun disk as the glyph or pictorial representation. Thus, we see that three of the main pillars of ancient Egyptian culture can be directly traced back to Sumeria, its point of origin, which entails the title Pharaoh, the sun god of Ra, and the falcon has its origin in Sumeria, not Egypt. The truths are essential in understanding the fact that ancient Egypt owes its cultural development to Sumerian culture. While Egypt may have a legacy which makes it unique among the world, it can no longer be denied that she owes what may seemingly be called her greatest achievements to ancient Sumeria or Asiatic culture. The first dynastic king of Egypt originates in Sumeria, the biblical Nimrod known as Narmer in Egypt and Namaru in Sumeria. The great Egyptologist Sir Flinders Petrie is among the first of our contemporary era to discover, uncover, and reveal the link between these two ancient kingdoms, using archaeology as its basis for asserting truth. When we speak of Egyptian culture from here on, we cannot deny its Mesopotamian roots, for understanding the root is key to discerning the fruit of the tree.